Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think I lost my. Okay, welcome back. And now we are going to our next session. And we have a system librarian from University of Kentucky, and Jason Griffith. He's going to give us his presentation. I'll let her introduce himself and start his presentation. And first, let me make you the co-host. Jason, let me find you. Hold on, I couldn't find Jason. Oh, I can just do that. Yes, here you are.
Okay. Get the screen going here. Okay, can everybody see the presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending the presentation today. As Tal said, my name is Jason Griffith. I am the systems librarian at University of Kentucky. It's a position I've held now since January of this year. I previously held the systems librarian position at Morehead State from 2017 until taking over at UK. So, you know, I have a pretty, I think, you know, decently extensive background working with Alma and Primo. But today, what I wanted to present on is a project that I started to work on shortly after coming to UK. And that is to create a discovery import profile for generic XML source records in Alma to be displayed in Primo VE. So just kind of go over a quick background of the project and the purpose of the project. So the purpose of this project was to display the digitized newspapers from the Kentucky Digital Newspaper Project in our InfoCat discovery, which is what we call Primo. And there are several reasons why we decided to kind of go this route. One is funding. The current setup for the KDNP is hosted on an expensive third-party service, so we want to try to cut some costs there. Another being infrastructure. Much of the infrastructure that was in place when the project began, I think it's been over 15 years ago since the project began, a lot of that infrastructure is now gone. And another is to fully use Alma and Primo's capabilities. And we wanted to do that to sort of increase our efficiency in controlling and displaying the content that we have, to reduce the costs, as I mentioned before, and also to meet our user needs a bit more, in that we're putting that content into an interface that users are more familiar with, rather than where it's at now. So just to give a sort of a brief background and some more information about the Kentucky Digital Newspaper Project. So that project began over 60 years ago when a historian and a library director traveled around the Commonwealth of Kentucky to digitally preserve newspapers around the region. And so from those humble beginnings, this project arose, and it's now a vital part of the UK Library's digital preservation efforts. And more information about the KDNP, there are over 260 newspaper titles currently available in the repository, with issues dating back to the 18th century, and lots of thematic representations in the collection. Topics, you know, African-American newspapers, emancipation, college university newspapers, agriculture, a lot of political newspapers represented, and as well as the largest assembly in the collection being newspapers from the Civil War era. So when you have that all together, we're currently looking at over 87,000 metadata records for the KDNP project. So we wanted to find some way to get all of those records, all that metadata into Primo for our users. So just a little bit more background on this about the actual project itself that we decided to work on. So we had a few different questions that we wanted to address before we kind of got this off the ground. And a team that manages the digital newspaper project and the team that manages Alma and Primo sort of all got together back in, I believe it was late January, to discuss sort of what was possible and if it is possible to get this metadata into Primo, what are the best ways to do that? And so after looking into this a little bit more, these questions that you see here are sort of what arose from that. So the first question is, what method of display will we use to get that information out there? And we thought about a couple of different things. One is the collection discovery interface in Primo. So we were already looking at using that. It was an underutilized portion of the system for us. And so we were already thinking of a way to get that out there. And we wondered if it could be used to get this content out there as well. And another that we decided to look at is using a discovery import profile. And since we had the switch to Primo V on the horizon, and we are about to undergo that switch in July, on July 1st, I had some previous experience working with Primo V and specifically with discovery import profiles from my days at Moorhead. So that was another thing that we decided to look at, and ultimately that's the direction that we decided to go. Another question that we looked at was, where do we want the data to live? So basically, did we want to place that data on an external server, define an SFTP profile, and import the data in that way? Did we want to use OAI? And that was sort of where my experience was in the past with content like this. Or did we want to load the content in using the discovery import profile, the file loader method? So that's where we've decided to go with that for now. And finally, the formats. So in looking at the records themselves that we needed to upload, the records that the archivists have put together are in JSON format. So the digital library architect here decided that it's probably best to create a generic XML file to mimic that data as a starting point for this. We did look at the possibility of making MARC records out of that data so that we could have more field flexibility, and also to do those in Dublin Core so that we could avoid having to do the normalizations that we have to do with generic XML. But ultimately, we decided to go with generic XML because of the fact that we could mimic that data that's already in the JSON files and to just sort of make it a little bit easier on the digital archives team. So with that said, to get the project underway, there are basically 6 steps that I've worked on to get this going. And at a minimum, when I first started looking at this, I knew that steps 1 through 3 that you see here would have to be done. Obviously, having to create the discovery import profile, having to normalize the data and create the normalization process to normalize the data. But as I went along, other things started to pop up that I realized that I should do as well, such as creating local fields, a local resource type, and mapping thumbnails for display. So I want to mention also as I go through this that this is not going to be a linear presentation of these steps, because as I went through this process, I realized, specifically with steps 4 through 6 here, that there were things that I needed to do that I had to back up and go back and do and then go back forward. So it's not going to be a linear look, 1 through 6. I'm going to be kind of jumping around a bit. So just wanted to point that out. So starting off, the first part of the process is to create the discovery import profile in Alma. And so to do that, you're going to go to Discovery, Loading External Data Sources, then to the Discovery Import Profiles. And once you click there, you get into the Add New Profile section, and you add that profile. And I've also on the slides linked documentation, and I can share this presentation later on, just quicker access to those documentation. So when you go in to create the import profile, we are looking for a discovery profile so that we can load these records from an external system for discovery into Primo V. And then when getting to the import profile itself, there's some basic information that you need to fill out, and 3 tabs at the top, which I'll kind of go through at different points. But you have your required information that you have to add in. Pretty self-explanatory on this part: profile name, a description, entering in source codes and labels. The originating system, you could choose some systems that were available in the dropdown, such as bpress, for example. But since we're not using any of the systems that were defined there as in an originating system, so we just looked at other. For import protocol, this is where you would choose FTP, OAI. Since we were going with file uploader, though, we chose to do that. Physical source format, we are looking at an XML file, and if you're going to use a generic XML file, physical source format has to be XML in this drop-down box before you can choose generic XML. Target format, we want to take the generic XML and translate that into Dublin Core and make the status active so that we can go ahead and get that running. So that was sort of the top section of the profile details, is the profile details information there. But the next section is sort of where I had a little bit of confusion on what to fill out. And so this is where the file splitter parameters comes in. And basically what we're doing with this section is just taking the information from the source file and defining these different tags in the file splitter so that the import profile will know where to look to see where this data lives in the source format. And so this chart that you see down here at the bottom is taken directly from the documentation to describe what you would include into these 3 required fields in the field splitter parameters. So you have your root element tag, which is the name of the first tag in the file, should be the collection tag. Record elements tag represents the beginning of a record, and the XPath to the identifier tag, which is the tag that contains the unique identifier for the record. So looking at that information, and over on the right, I have just thrown in the test XML file I used to set this up. And so this is where all 3 pieces of what needs to be put into the file splitter parameters came from. So root element tag being collection, the record elements tag, newspaper issue, and then the XPath to identifier tag, this ID tag here. So when I took all of that information and placed that into the file splitter parameters, this is what resulted from that. So collection, newspaper issue, and then the path itself to the identifier. Now, just as a quick, something that I had to deal with when I did this, and at first I didn't really know that this was the case, but I figured it out. When you're placing that XPath to identifier tag in, you're not just putting in the tag itself, an ID. You want to make sure that you have the elements tag in before that and then ID afterwards. So just a quick, heads up if you're going to look in to do that. That's what you need to do to get that set up. So this is the first tab for profile details. And at this point, I'm not going to move forward to normalization and delivery because those will come up sort of later as I go through the presentation. But this is just the jumping off point for actually getting the import profile designed. So the next thing to talk about is creating the normalization rules. So again, we started off with a generic XML file that mimics the JSON format. And the initial load that I got was one file for one newspaper with 1,170 total issues. And this is for the Adair County News. So I had to take what I had in the source file and find a method to normalize the generic XML that was in the source file to Dublin Core fields. So I took that file of 1,170 issues and I took that down to just one issue, a very small set to test on. And so that's what you see here is just the XML for the one issue that I'm working on. And the challenge, I guess, at this point was just to determine how to write the normalization rule to include all of the fields you see down here, because some of these fields do not directly correspond to Dublin Core fields. Some did, but some didn't. So that was sort of the challenge there. So starting off with the normalization rule, to create that rule, you go to the resources menu in Alma, open up the metadata editor, click File, then New, and then you want to go down to the normalization rules, but specifically for the purpose of this project, normalization rules for XML. You can choose normalization rules for MARC and for Dublin Core as well, but since we're dealing with a source format XML file, this is the type of normalization rule that we want to create. So then you have your properties box that pops up after you click new, and required fields, name and description. But the bottom portion of this box is important too, because you want to make sure that shared is selected rather than private, because when you get to the point of creating the normalization process itself, if this isn't shared, then you're not going to be able to find that to put into the normalization process. And you also want to make sure it's enabled, because again, if it's not enabled, then you're not going to be able to actually find it to put into the process. So just a couple of important reminders. So when getting to the point of creating the normalization rule, I first started this off by using the documentation that you see linked here at the top. And I just decided to sort of look at one field, and that was the doc title T field, where we take the title of the document itself from the source record. And I tried to create a rule basically using the formula that you see down here at the bottom, this sample normalization rule here. So I tried doing that, and I went through different iterations of this on that documentation that's linked at the top. But anytime that I tried to create that and then load the record, I ran into an issue. And so I spent a little bit of time testing with that before I figured out the right way of doing it. And I found the right way of doing it by doing some Google searching to try to find sort of a live example that someone had created out there that I could use. And what I found was the documentation that you see linked here from the Knowledge Center. It's an article titled Generic XML Normalization Rules and XPath Tips. And there's a certain section called Attribute Text as Condition, where I actually found the correct syntax to create this normalization rule. And you can see it down here at the bottom. This is the sample that it created, or that's displayed. And so what I did was I basically just took this exist local name, this condition that you see here, and that's how I started to create the normalization rule itself. And so just for testing the title, just the one field out of this XML record, this is the rule that I came up with. So, again, going back, looking at the local name condition, it's a very simple rule. Once you see that, it's basically when exists this local name in the file, this tag doc title T, then we want to copy that to the DC title field, and that's the end of the rule. So to test on this rule to make sure that this is actually going to work, you could click on Save and Test using External Record. And so that's what I did. And this on the next window, you will have the Testing External Discovery Records box pop up. You're choosing the record type, so we want to make sure that we're choosing Generic XML, uploading the file with the browser. Not only clicking to find it, but clicking upload as well. That even after testing this several times, I still sometimes forget to click upload, and it's frustrating. So always remember to do that after you get your file loaded in. And then you want to select the test type of normalization rule, and then choose the normalization rule that you created to test. So you see the source record here on the left, and then the normalized record over on the right. And so looking at the normalized record section, I see that this rule actually did exactly what I wanted it to do. It took what was in the doc title T field and moved that over to the DC title field for display on the front end. So that looks great. And once I saw that that was working, then I went about going through and creating rules for all of the other fields within the generic XML file. And so the normalized record over on the right, after going through that process of testing again, I see all of the different fields here on the right that were in the generic XML record. And I see now that they are being normalized correctly. So once I saw that, I was ready to actually take the record, load it into the import profile, and see what happens on the front end, what's displaying. So to test the import, you go to Discovery, to Loading External Data Sources, and back to the Discovery Import Profiles. Click the ellipsis button next to the import profile that you created. Click on Run. Then after clicking on Run, you have your file selection input pop up. Again, use Browse, or I think you can click and drag that in if you have it open too, but I always just use Browse. To bring up the file, label the file, click Add. And once you have that file over here, you'll see it after you add it in, then you click Submit. And if it works correctly, you'll be able to see under over here, if you click on the ellipsis button on history, you'll be able to see the job history. So if it runs correctly, you'll see the most recent job and it will say, you know, completed successfully, unsuccessfully. So you'll be able to check to make sure that that actually worked. So this was the first attempt over here on the right side of loading this record into Primo VE for display. And so as you can see over here on the left, we have a lot of different fields within the actual generic XML file itself, but very few of these fields listed under the details section of the full record view. So taking that into consideration and knowing that we had much more information that we actually wanted to display, I decided to look into seeing how we could get that information actually into the record for display on the front end. And so that's where the topic of creating local fields came up from. So the fields that do not perfectly display to something, to a field for Dublin Core to display on the front end, creating the local fields and then normalizing the data from the XML file to those local fields was sort of the way to go. And I'd had some experience doing this before when I worked with Discovery Import Profiles. So, you know, the documentation that I have up here, I kind of use that as guidance, but since I had that little bit of previous experience, you know, it wasn't too difficult for me to go through and do that. So you can create these local fields. There's 50 max that you can create for Dublin Core. And to create those fields, you go into Alma, into Discovery, Manage, Display in Local Fields, and then Add Field here. And you have the option of adding a display or a local field. And for this, we want to add a local field. And after clicking that, this is where the define local field pops up, and where you go through and actually choose the parameters here to determine how you want to display that field on the front end. So for example, local field 1, I chose to be the rights from the generic XML file. And on the local field details, there's a few different things you can choose here. You can enable the field for search, but the system actually automatically indexes local fields regardless of that setting, but it will not be searchable without checking that, and you can't use it for a facet without checking that as well. So that's just an important note. And if you want to use it as a facet, you have to enable field for facet to be able to do that. But you know, if you choose enable field for facet, you have to also make sure that you enable it for search. And then if you want to use translations that are defined in the local field translate code table, you would click on the use translations box. So the other areas that you see over here, we're going to talk about the parallel local field on the next slide, but the use full text links for indexing, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So using the parallel local field from the Dublin Core record, looking at the documentation for this, the purpose behind this is to select this field if you have defined Dublin Core normalization rules that map information to local discovery fields. So those 1 through 50 fields that you can create for Dublin Core local fields, that's where that comes from. So clearly I needed to check this option because I had so many fields that I needed to normalize to DC fields or to local fields, I'm sorry. So I had to check that for each of the local fields that I created. And that was 13 in total. So this is the result of all of the fields basically that didn't show up on the initial import. I created the local discovery fields for those, and just went down the line and created those. So once I created those, then I realized that I needed to create a second set of normalization rules that would then take the information from the generic XML and map that into those discovery local fields that we had just created before. So I had to go through and do that. And this part actually went by a little bit faster this time around because I'd already gotten the hang of creating this rule exactly the way that it needed to be created to map from the generic XML to the Dublin Core. So this wasn't nearly as complicated to do this time, but same format. When exists this particular tag from the generic XML record, then I'm copying that to the appropriate discovery local field that I defined on the previous slide. So going down the line and doing that again, after doing that, I clicked on Save and Test and went through the process of loading the source file in to test that out to see what that looked like. And this was the result of that. So again, source records over here on the left and the normalized record over here on the right. So the information that I wanted to normalize to those discovery fields are now showing up over here. And when we defined the local display fields a couple of slides back, we defined how those labels will show up on the front end. So you'll see that how that all translates here in just a second. So now that I had the two sets of normalization rules that I needed to go ahead and normalize everything from the generic XML record, then I had to create the normalization process itself. And the purpose of that is to combine those two normalization rules into one process that will be used to load all of that generic XML data upon import. So to do that, you're going to go to Configuration, Discovery, Loading External Data Sources, and this time the Normalization Process task. And that's what you see down here at this window at the bottom, and you click on Add Process to begin that. So there are a few different steps that you see, 4 steps actually, for creating the normalization process. The first step is to choose the business entity. And in this case, what we're trying to do with this normalization process is to publish BIB records for discovery. So we're choosing discovery BIB records as the business entity here. And for type, there's only 2 options to choose from when you choose discovery BIB records in the business entity field. One was discovery generic XML and one was discovery Dublin Core. So obviously we needed discovery generic XML for the type there. Then moving on to step 2 is just your basic information, the name of the process itself, a description of the process, and then making sure that that process is active. So steps 3 and 4 is where you actually go in to choose the normalization rules that you designed before to add into the normalization process. So you click on Add Tasks when that pops up, and you only have one thing to choose from here, which is the generic XML normalization. But since I had 2 of those normalization rules that I created, I had to add the generic XML normalization twice. And I wanted to make sure that they were sequenced in a certain way to where the first set of rules would run, then the second set of rules after that in the process. So in step 4 is where you're actually choosing the rules that you created and adding it into the tasks that you provided into this normalization process. So the top section that you see down here in the step 4 is the first normalization rule that I wanted to use when uploading this. So I chose that first rule, and then the second is the second rule. So that gets the sequence together. Then at the very end was to just, I'm sorry, that's done after that. Once you click save, that the normalization process is done. But then going back to the import profile itself, to the normalization tab, this is where you choose that normalization process that you just created to use when uploading that record. So the KDNP process is what I just designed for the normalization process. So chose that from the drop-down menu, click save, and then that normalization process was selected for the import profile. So going back through the steps again to test the record, I re-uploaded this record into Primo VE, and this is what I saw after that. So instead of these, 5 fields that showed up under the details tag before, I now have all this additional information from the source record that we wanted to display, that we had to create those local fields to display. So a lot more descriptive and easier for our patrons to sort of look at this and see what they need, find the information that they need to see off of the record. So doing this, this looks really good, but we also noticed a couple of other things once we uploaded the record that we decided that we wanted to change in order to make it, a little bit better for our users on the front end. So one of those was this resource type at the top. Out of the box, news issue is defined. So we didn't really like news issue as the resource type, and we wanted to change that. We went through and discussed different options for what we would change that to, but ultimately we landed on newspaper issue is what we wanted to change that to. So to do that, that required creating a local resource type. And again, documentation is linked here at the top, but just a quick way of doing that, if you go to configuration, discovery, local resource types, and click on add local resource type, then you are directed to this form that you fill out to actually create that local resource type. So a lot of this is very, self-explanatory, adding the code in, making sure that it's active, the label that you actually want to see rather than what you are seeing. So you have the singular and the plural versions of those labels. So those are entered in. The RIS type, metadata format, and genre fields are not required, but I entered information into those anyway. And I just sort of chose the best information I could based on what options were available in the drop down. So newspaper, issue, and journal was what I chose for that. And then the other important part for this is if you're using a MARC record, you would map it from the MARC record field. But since we were using Dublin Core, we went down to the bottom box and clicked on add condition to bring up the exact field where we're pulling this information from. So this that lives in the DC terms format is where this was actually normalized from. And the value in that field was newspaper issue. So you're just making sure that you're choosing where that data lives in the source file and then what that data is. And that's what you're pulling in to be the local resource type. So at the top, you see the sort of out of the box setting that we had that we didn't really want, news issue. And at the bottom, you see our customization, newspaper issue. So we like that a lot better. And it was a bit more descriptive. So, we were very happy with that change. But there were a couple of other things as well that we saw on here that we wanted to change. So that required going back to the actual discovery import profile itself and finishing out the last tab, which is the delivery tab. So one thing that we wanted to do was, just to go back a couple slides, instead of seeing under full text availability this generic view resource label, we wanted to have something else entered there, a bit more descriptive. So we chose view at KDNP for the link label itself. So very simple change, nothing overly dramatic, basically choosing static URL from source. So we're just pointing Alma to where in the source file the link to that resource actually lives, that being in the DC identifier field, and then choosing the label language itself under the link label. So the other thing that we wanted to change from looking at this was the thumbnail. So as you can see, when you look at the brief records or the full record, either way for this particular issue, you see this very generic document thumbnail here. And so when I had looked at the what was displayed on the KDNP site, they had a actual scan of the newspaper issue itself for the thumbnail image. And I liked that, and I wanted that to be represented into Primo, because it's just, a bit more tailor-made for that specific issue. So I talked to our digital library architect about that. Since I saw that that thumbnail was there, I wanted to figure out a way to display that. So we went through a couple minor issues in getting that set up. The first is the file extension. So in the documentation, you'll see that for thumbnail images, there are certain supported formats. You have bitmap, PNG, JPEG, and then the phrase "and so forth" is listed after that. Well, as it turns out, a GIF is not included in the "and so forth" category, and GIF is what was used from the KDNP site for the thumbnail image. So I talked to our digital library architect about converting that to a JPEG, which he did do. So then we were able to get the file extension situation sorted out at that point. And the next sort of issue that I had was normalizing that into an XML field. And we wanted to choose a field that we weren't using anywhere else in the record to normalize that to, so that we could point in the delivery tab, we could point, well, let me go back and see. On this static URL from source, you want to be able to point to a tag in the file where you're going to be taking that from. So that's what we were trying to define here for the normalizing this field. And then we wanted to add that Dublin Core field to the import profile. And that was sort of the last step of that particular part of the project. So the three issues, how we were able to address those are all kind of explained in these images. So instead of having the GIF image linked to in the thumbnail URL T field in the source record, we changed that to the JPEG field. The digital library architect came up with that. Then added that normalization rule for thumbnail from the local field in this file to DC terms relation. Since we were not using relation anywhere else, we decided just to use that as the field that we were pulling the thumbnail image from, and then adding that to the import profile under the delivery tab. We're just basically, again, pointing DC terms relation as the field where we're actually pulling that thumbnail from. So after all that, this is what we ended up with. We have now the thumbnail for this specific issue listed so that it just looks a lot better and is not generic in that generic image that we saw before. So it just looks a little bit better for the overall presentation. And so after all this work, this is what we see in the brief record view in Primo V and the full record view. So we went from having very few fields displayed from the initial import, not having a local resource type defined, the link label being sort of generic, and having that generic image instead of this specific image to display. So this obviously looks a lot better, and we were very happy with the results that this produced. And I just thought I would show this. This is just when you click on the display source record on the full record view. This is what you're seeing as the record that is being loaded into Primo V from this import profile. So from this, you can see all these pieces of information that we entered in from that source record field that we normalized to DC fields and to the local fields. So it's just kind of neat, I guess, to see a visual representation of all that work that's into this specific XML format. So this all looks great, and we were all very happy with everything, but there is one final obstacle that we have yet to overcome in this process before we can go through and load all of these issues in and have this project completed. And that is to harvest the full text for search. So the goal here being to be able to search keywords and phrases to locate an article or an issue from that collection. And according to the documentation that you see linked here, this should be entirely possible to do that. Having an externally held text file of a PDF, text, HTML that's linked from in the source record, then Primo VE should be able to use that to harvest that full text and do that for searching. So I went through all of the different steps in the documentation to figure that out. And that's, if you remember, all the way back when we talked about creating the local fields, that box that says use full text for harvesting. That down here is what you theoretically should be able to check to be able to do that. And, you know, just all of the other pieces of this that should have all added up to seeing success with this. You have the actual field itself that the PDF file is referenced in. We have the rule taking that field print URLT and mapping that to that discovery local field 13. And then in the discovery local field 13 settings, we have use full text links for indexing checked. But after going through all of that, we still have this question mark as to why this is actually not displaying. So at this point, this is where I'm at. I've only loaded this one record into the sandbox to sort of test out. You know, my process is always starting small and going big. So I want to make sure that the one record itself is actually displaying perfectly the way I want before I expand that out to everything else. And I've had a ticket open with Ex Libris about this since probably about February. And it's gone through several different processes. I think currently it's in the Primo Tier 2 team to be investigated. Every now and then I go through and check this just to see if maybe it's working, but so far it's not started working yet. So this is the last part of the process. I'm confident at some point we're going to see this. And then ultimately this project will be a success. So now I want to thank you all for listening to the presentation and happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Jason. This is really useful and nice to see your customization. I'm glad that you included lots of the link to the documentation and really look forward when you finish the whole project and how finishing the full load and keep us updated. Mm-hmm. And we do have some questions from the chat. And here, let me read. Can you see? Okay, I'll read one. There's one question from Jamin. He's asking, can the mapping to local fields work with OAI imports? And he suspects not. Okay.
Oh, yes? I'm sorry. Yes, yes, I did do that before when I worked at Moorhead, and we had an OAI import in, and I was able to map certain fields to get. I think it was specifically for the document title, or not the document title, the file. It's like what type of file you're looking at. Initially, it was sort of set up generically. It didn't have, say, image, text document, video, audio, that sort of thing. So I was able to use that to link that in and display that onto the front end.
That's great. And you did mention about the full text search, and Jamin was wondering, is the full text maybe require a TXT file instead of building in? I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's something.
Well, the documentation said that it could be a PDF, a TXT, or an HTML file. So theoretically, any of those file types should work for the harvesting. Mm-hmm. We've not tried a different file type, but just going by the documentation, if PDF should work, then we figure it should work like that. So, maybe trying a different one would be the way to solve it, though.
Great. Yeah, keep us posted once the whole thing is working. And Matt asked, does the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives also hold or mirror those resources the KDNP resources, or newspapers.com. Is this on archive.org? Seems that's a URL, or am I mistaken? So that's, I guess, yeah, Matt is asking, is those also available in other places or mirrored by other sites?
Oh yeah, there's a different, I think it's through Internet Archive, I believe, is where those are actually hosted and where that links back to.
Good. Matt, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Cool, great. Any more questions? And this is great. Yeah, then people was saying, Christina was saying, great presentation. Love the details. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, if there's
Thanks, everyone.
no